Hello, Connecticut, and welcome to the Paid Leave Podcast. The title basically says it all. I'm Nancy Barrow, and I will be delving into this new state program and how it can help you and your family. This podcast will give you information you should know about Connecticut paid leave and maybe just a little bit more. Connecticut paid leave brings peace of mind to your home, family, and workplace. Welcome to the Paid Leave Podcast. The topic today is paid leave and how it affects businesses, small businesses, and women on pregnancy and bonding leave and their earning potential. Maya Rossin-Slater is an associate professor of health policy at Stanford University School of Medicine. She's a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic and Policy Research, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a research affiliate at the Institute of Labor Economics. She got her PhD in economics from Columbia University, her BA in economics and statistics from the University of California at Berkeley, and her research includes topics like paid leave and healthcare and public and labor economics. She focuses on issues in maternal and child well-being and family structure and behavior, health disparities, and public policies affecting disadvantaged populations in the United States and actually in other developed countries. She's the recipient of the National Science Foundation Career Award and has published articles in a variety of peer-reviewed journals like the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Her paid leave research includes California and New York, a little bit of Rhode Island, and we'll find out if there are any other states that she is looking at. Welcome to the podcast, Maya.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh my gosh, it's such an honor to have you here with us. I'm so thrilled that you're on this podcast with me. I wanted to give you some interesting stats, since you're a stats person, about Connecticut paid leave. And cumulatively, since we opened for claims applications in December of 2021, we started giving benefits in January of 2022. And we've had a total of 134,384 claims. And of those that were approved as of June 26th of this month, or this year, we have had a total of 83,564 workers get benefits, which is really cool. And as of June 1st, we've given $375 million in those benefits.
I think, Connecticut is a fairly small state. Most of my experience in terms of research comes from California.
Yeah, rather large.
And so, it's hard to compare the numbers, across those states. But in terms of take up, like as a share of population who's eligible, it sounds like Connecticut is doing great. And in part, perhaps that's because you all are really good at getting the word out. One of the challenges with a lot of state paid family leave policies is that, especially in the first few years, take up of leave tends to be low because people just don't know about it. Like in California, I think 10 years after California's program went into effect in 2004, they did a survey of California voters, and something like only about a third of them even had heard of the program.
Wow.
So I think awareness and just like how to navigate the system tends to be, pretty low in many places. So it sounds like Connecticut is doing great.
Yeah, I think there's 3.6 million people in Connecticut. So I think it's a pretty good number who have actually utilized the program.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, let's talk about how you started your research and why you decided to focus on paid leave. What was the motivating factor for you in doing this collaborative research?
Back in grad school, I was studying economics, but I was really interested in topics related to families and kids. I worked a lot with infant health data and maternal health data. And I recognized that, we have quite a bit of research, looking at, for example, the impacts of smoking during pregnancy on infant health and sort of things like that. But we kind of knew a lot less, especially at that time, which was now more than a decade ago, about policies affecting families in which parents work. And how that affects infant and child well-being. So that sort of my first foray into this world of leave was through the Family Medical Leave Act. So that's the only piece of federal legislation that the United States has on leave. And it's an unpaid leave policy, provides 12 weeks of unpaid leave to eligible workers. Only about 60% of the U.S. workforce are eligible for the FMLA, but it's been around since 1993. So my first study was looking at the impact of the introduction of the Family Medical Leave Act on infant health. And the thing that I found that was sort of really striking to me is that the FMLA did lead to improvements in infant health, for example, in terms of improvements in birth weight and lower infant mortality rates. But these benefits only accrued to relatively advantaged families, right? So kids in families where mothers were married and, college educated or higher. And that makes a lot of sense. With an unpaid leave policy, you got to be able to afford to take, 12 weeks of unpaid leave. And also these more advantaged families were more likely to be eligible for the policy in the first place. So that really got me thinking about what else can we learn about paid leave? And California was the first state to introduce paid family leave back in 2004. So I teamed up with Jane Woldfogel, who's a professor at the School of Social Work at Columbia, which is where I was in grad school. And she's been working on family leave for many decades now, mostly on FMLA. And we decided to kind of start working on California paid family leave, and the rest is history. And we've been working on it since.
A lot of your articles have like 4 people in them. How do you find those people and who's responsible for what?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So again, I'm an economist by training, and econ, we tend to do sort of alphabetical ordering of authorship and equal co-authorship. And in terms of who does what, typically 1 or 2 people who are sort of the most junior on the team end up doing the actual data work. So early on, I was the person, doing all the data analysis, and so on. And then as I progressed, my students, for example, started working with us and leading the data analysis. But all of us contribute to kind of thinking about the research questions, figuring out what methodology to use, interpreting the results that we're getting, figuring out the data, and then actually writing the articles and disseminating the research. And, it's actually a pretty small network of people that work on the topic of paid leave, especially in the U.S. So since, the U.S. is like the only high income country in the world that doesn't have sort of a federal policy related to paid parental leave. So there's quite a bit of research on leave outside of the U.S. And a network of people working on those topics. But within the U.S., it's really not that many of us. It's sort of a growing list of people as more and more states are passing these policies, and sort of it's more on the radar. But, we kind of mostly all know each other and are in similar sort of in circles.
It must be nice to see how there is like a blossoming bunch of states that are now getting into the paid leave playing field. It's growing and growing. Do you think that your research is going to grow as the states grow?
Yeah, definitely. It's super exciting. When you look at sort of the state of the literature or the evidence on paid leave, like probably 90% of the studies on this are in California. And that's because for a long time, California was really one of the few states that had the policy. And it's now been around long enough so we can really measure long-term effects. But, because California was first, the subsequent states that implemented policies, they learned in some ways from California's mistakes, right? So, for example, originally California's policy did not have, and actually still doesn't have job protection within it. Many states have introduced job protection. Or California's policy was originally only 6 weeks. It's more recently been expanded, but subsequent states have, made it a longer duration. Different states have also introduced different ways of sort of setting the wage replacement rate. So all of these things, and it's really critical to sort of understand the details of the policy, right? Like the devil's in the details. So,
yeah.
Paid leave can look like many different things in terms of how long it is, who pays for it, who's eligible for it, all of these things. And we need to really figure that out. And we need research to be able to figure that out. And as more and more states do this, and they do it slightly differently from one another, that provides us with sort of a real world laboratory to really understand these issues.
What were your findings in states like California and New York? And I know you've done some in Rhode Island as well.
In California, we've done a number of studies mostly focused on the impacts of the original introduction of California's paid leave policy on a variety of outcomes for workers and their families. So, for example, we looked at leave take-up by both mothers and new fathers. And sort of a critical finding from that work was that the introduction of paid leave really led to a major increase in the use of leave for women who recently had a child. And this impact was really concentrated amongst less advantaged populations. So if you think about it, there's large disparities in access to leave in the U.S., from employers, for example, and the use of that leave. And so California's policy really reduced those inequities in a pretty major way. And then the other thing that's sort of under a lot of discussion and debate in the paid leave space is whether paid family leave is good or bad for women's careers. And you can see how there could be opposing views on this, right? So on the one hand, kind of advocates for paid leave might say, well, if a woman would have otherwise quit her job, right, and stalled her career in the absence of paid leave, then having access to something like paid leave actually promotes career continuity, promotes, their progression in their career, improves their long-term labor market trajectories. On the opposite side, some folks might argue, well, if otherwise she would have not taken any time off or very little time off, leave prolongs that and maybe, makes them want to stay out of the labor force. And there's also this concern, given sort of these big gender disparities in terms of who is likely to use the leave, that employers might discriminate against women and, knowing that now they're going to take leave, maybe be less likely to hire them or promote them or something like that. So there's this sort of debate. To be honest, if you sort of think about the California policy or any of the current U.S. policies and think about what exists outside of the United States, you kind of quickly realize that a lot of these concerns really don't seem super valid. I mean, there's countries that have more than a year-long leave policies. And what we know from research outside of the U.S. is that really anything under a year in length doesn't seem to have any big damages to women's careers. It's really when we look at policies that are 2, maybe 3 years in length, right, where women are staying out of the labor force for that length of time, that's when we start to see sort of the negative implications for their careers. So when we're looking at the U.S., we're talking about at most 3 months or something like that. And so we found that basically, by and large, these policies in California at least has had sort of either very small positive or really null effects on women's labor market trajectories. And a lot of the benefit is really concentrated on family health outcomes. So there's work showing, for example, that kids are less likely to be hospitalized for preventable causes once paid leave is in place. There's work showing improvements in breastfeeding and increases in breastfeeding duration once paid leave is in place. And there's work showing improvements in maternal health, especially maternal mental health, once paid leave is in place. And so I think sort of the largest benefit in terms of having a policy like paid family leave, in my mind, is sort of the health and well-being of the family, and especially for lower income or otherwise disadvantaged families that might not have access to any other type of leave, that the state can now sort of fill that gap. In terms of gender equity, I tend to say paid leave is not a silver bullet for solving gender equity issues.
I love that terminology that you said. Paid family leave is not a silver bullet.
Right. I think maybe it helps a bit, but it's not sort of going to be the end all and be all of sort of solving gender equity issues in the American labor market. And the policy in most states is funded through employee payroll taxes. In some states, employers also contribute. But really, in terms of the sort of the financial cost, it's pretty minimal for employers. But most of the opponents of paid leave policies around the country tend to be small business advocates. The Chamber of Commerce for a long time had a negative stance on paid leave policies, for example. And the main argument there is that, even if employers aren't directly paying for these benefits, there's all these potential other kind of indirect costs for businesses, especially small businesses, where, if you can imagine it's a business of maybe 10 people, somebody goes out on leave for 12 weeks, they have to figure out what to do, right? They still have to run their business. They have to maybe hire temporary replacement, maybe other workers have to sort of chip in. And that could be disruptive. That could affect their productivity, profitability, all of these things. So there's a lot of sort of concern about what happens to businesses. And for many years, we really didn't have good data on what's going on with businesses. So what we decided to do was we sort of had been hearing that New York was going to implement their policy starting in 2018. So back in 2016, we decided to go in and start surveying small employers up to 100 employees in size in the state of New York. And then we also did the same in sort of comparison states, which included New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania does not have any paid leave policy, whereas New Jersey has had a paid leave policy since 2009. And we basically surveyed these employers every year from 2016 through 2020, through fall of 2020, so during COVID. And what we then did is we looked at how the introduction of paid family leave, which occurred in 2018 in New York, affected these employers' responses to questions related to, how they navigate employees taking leave or being absent from work. Does it affect their productivity? Does it affect employee morale? How do they deal? Is it hard or easy to deal with these absences? And so on. And by and large, what we found is really there doesn't seem to be any major negative impacts on businesses in New York. If anything, they actually reported that it was somewhat easier to deal with employee absences. Now, you might wonder why that is, because obviously the policy would lead to more employee absences, and now exists this leave policy. But my hunch is that what happens is, before paid leave, people still had babies, right? And they still needed to sort of take time off, or they had, even if they didn't have babies, they had other caregiving needs, right? And employers, especially small ones, would have to sort of navigate this on a case-by-case basis each time. And once you introduce a state level policy, it's actually easier because now there's like a system in place and you can, you don't have to pay for it, right? You can sort of send your workers to that system, and it actually makes things smoother and easier. And then finally, the last thing we find is, because we kind of kept the survey going during COVID, we were able to look at changes in employer attitudes towards paid leave. We basically just asked them to rate it on like a scale of very opposed to very supportive from before COVID to during COVID. And what we actually found is that support for the policy increased during fall of 2020, which, is consistent with employers realizing like how important this policy is, especially in the context of something like a pandemic.
What do you think the reasons are that we don't have a national paid leave policy yet?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $1 million question. I've been doing this work now for, since like 2010 or something like that. And, people have been asking me that question during that whole time. And I think there's more momentum now with all the different states passing these policies. I mean, I think initially my response would have been something like, well, people are just really concerned about small businesses and the costs and so on. Now we have, to some extent better evidence, not just from, our team, but other teams as well, that it doesn't seem to be that big of a deal. But I think that's almost just like it's politics in some sense, right? Like there's just like a general ideological opposition to the government imposing something on employers. And so I think that's a fairly uniquely American thing. And so that maybe is the roadblock. I mean, we have seen that both, Democratic and Republican candidates have introduced various paid parental leave proposals, that are different in various sort of parameters, but at least they're on the radar, and that didn't used to be the case across the political spectrum. The thing that's more challenging these days is actually caregiving leave, or sort of leave for other reasons. I was on like a working group organized by a couple of different think tanks in DC that had a mix of researchers and policy people and advocates and so on. And we were sort of tasked with producing like this report, first about parental leave and second about caregiving leave, and then like to give our recommendations. And it was quite interesting because we had people kind of on different sides of the political spectrum involved in this. And there was it was pretty easy to get consensus on a paid parental leave policy. And we wrote our report. And then the second one, the caregiving, we could not reach consensus. And we ended up writing a report that we were not able to reach consensus on a single recommendation. People have very strong reservations about caregiving leave specifically. And it tends to be related to two things. One is there's just this general sense we don't know enough about it, who uses it, how much it would cost, and so on. That's changing a bit. There's more and more research on that now. So hopefully that will change in the coming years. And secondly, I think people are more concerned with fraud related to caregiving leave. All right. It's pretty easy to sort of detect whether someone had a baby. It's harder to figure out whether somebody has a family member who truly needs care and who that family member is and who's giving the care and all of these things. So it becomes there's these general concerns about people abusing the system. I haven't seen those concerns be borne out in any data that I've seen. But I think that's the reservation. So really, I think it's harder now to move the needle on kind of the other parts of family leave. Than it is on parental leave.
It's very interesting about caregiving because ours is even expanded more in the language of what a family is. So we do by affinity. So it can be a cousin, or it could be a coworker that you're really close to, or godson or something. So, or a neighbor, whoever is like family to you.
Yeah, that's very unusual, actually. I think states have struggled in terms of how to define what family means, and you have to live with that person and so on. And I think that's where a lot of also the concern is in terms of the opposition.
What can we learn from other countries and other states about how paid family leave might affect the workers' labor market outcomes?
Yeah, I think we can learn a lot of things from other countries.
Yeah.
There's really great research coming out, for example, out of Norway, where they looked at the original introduction of Norway's paid maternity leave policy, which happened in 1977, so way ahead of the U.S. And at the time, it was just 4 months, a 4-month-long paid maternity leave policy in Norway. And there have been a number of studies kind of tracing out the impacts of this on kids, on moms, and so on, and just finding overwhelming benefits for these families. So improvements in various markers of maternal health, decades later, as well as for the kids themselves, improvements in their educational attainment and their long-term earnings potential, and all of this concentrated amongst kind of relatively economically disadvantaged families. So paid maternity leave has had these, we can learn from these other countries that it has these, pretty big benefits. The other thing is that, increasingly, because paid maternity leave is sort of old news in most of these places, there have been a lot of discussion about how to get fathers more engaged in terms of taking leave. And so I think there's a lot of interesting lessons that we could learn from there. I mean, one interesting distinction between the policies in many other countries as compared to what we have here in the different states is that their leave is often allocated on a per child basis. And then it, for a long time, let's say you have the 12 or the 14 months or whatever, and parents can just split it however they want. So, if the child has two parents, let's say sort of in a heterosexual case, you have the mother and the father, they can share it however they want. And what they saw in the data is that mothers were using like 99.9% of the leave. And so there was this big push to get fathers more involved. And so a number of countries outside the US have implemented what are called daddy months or daddy quotas, which is basically like earmarked leave, where essentially, out of this big bulk of leave, 1, 2, 3 months are earmarked to each parent. So basically, if the father doesn't use his, allotted number of months, then the family just loses that time. So they can't just transfer it to the mother. And what they've learned is that these tend to be quite effective at increasing leave use amongst fathers. So, they're doing what they intended to do. But, again, it doesn't seem to be like this is the silver bullet for solving gender equity problems. And in that way, actually, the U.S. is doing better in the sense that our policies are at the individual worker level or the individual parent level. So we don't have any restrictions in terms of whether the parents can take it jointly or sequentially or, however they want. And I think that's a good thing. I think allowing families to have the option to be on leave together, especially in the early postpartum period, can be really valuable, in particular for maternal health.
Oh, it's so good. That's wonderful. Here in Connecticut for bonding leave, 12,900 women applied and 9,637 men applied for bonding leave.
That's pretty equitable.
Yeah, pretty equitable. The interesting thing that I found was that women took an average of 5.9 weeks out of 12. And men took an average of 6.5 weeks out of 12. Wow. Isn't that interesting?
So is that because they're the women are also using temporary disability?
They also use, since we've combined pregnancy and bonding, they can take time before as well.
I see. So that is not included in the 5.5 number?
No.
I see. But that is surprising. I mean, that's a big difference and a big change from what we saw in California, maybe a decade ago.
What about the benefit of health security for lower income or minority families or people who work a few part-time jobs? Did you find anything interesting about that? Did paid leave really help them?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know from our earlier research that the increases in take-up of leave have been concentrated amongst sort of lower income, less advantaged families. The eligibility criteria in California, at least, but I think this is the case for most other states, are pretty minimal. So you have to have earned $300 in earnings over the last 12 months. So it's very, very minimal. So it really is accessible to many families. I think that the big issue, though, the big barrier is whether or not there's job protection. So job protection means you're not able to be let go of your job when you return from your leave. And in California, the paid leave policy didn't have job protection attached to it. And I've been working with an organization here in California called Legal Aid for Work, which is a legal nonprofit that essentially helps low-income workers navigate a variety of employer job-related issues. And one of those is paid leave. And one of the concerns that they hear is that people are just people in, hourly jobs, retail, things like the restaurant industry are just afraid to lose their jobs. And then the other concern that they hear is that the wage replacement rate is too low. So especially in the initial iteration of the policy, the wage replacement rate was set at 55% of prior earnings, which, is quite low.
Yeah, that's low.
When your earnings are low.
Yeah. So
people can't necessarily, take advantage of the policy when they don't have their full earnings. So those are the barriers. So I think resolving those barriers, by which I mean including job protection in the policy and having some kind of progressive scale in terms of the replacement rate where lower income workers get more of their wages replaced during the leave, can do a lot to make sure that sort of these benefits and the security actually transmit to these families.
Yeah. With your other research about mother mortality, what were sort of the core of your findings?
Some of my other work is centered on understanding inequities in infant and maternal health. And most recently, we also looked again at California. A lot of my data is in California. What we did was we essentially provided some of the first evidence on how infant and maternal health it sort of evolves across the income distribution in California, and as well as by race and ethnicity. And what we found in particular for sort of our most extreme adverse outcomes, and that is infant mortality and maternal mortality, is that there's these huge, huge inequities in these outcomes. So mothers in the bottom of the income distribution, let's say the bottom 5-10% of the income distribution, are 3 times more likely to die in the first year of life than mothers in the top of the income distribution. Wow. The infant mortality gap is about double, right? So children at the bottom of the income distribution are 2 times more likely to die in the first year of life than children in the top of the income distribution. What's even more distressing is that this gap is totally amplified by race, where we basically see that income is not at all protective for Black mothers in particular, right? So essentially, the Black maternal and infant mortality rates at the top of the income distribution, so we're talking about the top 5-10% of the state of California, have similar mortality rates as white families at the very bottom of the income distribution, in many cases higher mortality rates. So there's these just huge inequities in these really, really, terrible outcomes. And, I think it really underscores the need to think holistically about how we can help these families. The fact that these racial gaps exist, even at the very top of the income distribution, really suggests that it's not just purely a story about income, and we really have to think carefully and systemically at sort of issues related to structural racism. And the other thing that I think is important to highlight is that a lot of deaths, both infants and maternal, happen outside of the healthcare system, meaning like outside of the hospital, outside of like the immediate postpartum period when we often think about these things. And this is where like what happens in the home and the policies that we have to support families in their postpartum period when they're at home, when they've sort of left the hospital and are, there trying to figure out how to take care of their new child is really important. And paid leave is really at the center of that. And so, understanding like the role paid leave might play in improving both maternal and infant health as we go forward, and in particular, what it might be able to do to potentially lower these inequities, both by income and race ethnicity, is really critical.
I just think it's important work and that people really should read it. It's very interesting research work.
Thank you.
What is the research that you're working on now?
I'm working on a couple of different things I'm happy to share about that are in various buckets related to families, I guess, in the U.S. So I have a set of projects actually looking at the impacts of gun violence and school shootings in particular on kids. Again, a fairly uniquely American phenomenon. I have another project where back in the paid family leave space, but now we're really thinking critically about caregivers who are not new parents. So looking at households in which, say, one spouse experiences some kind of health shock, and what happens to the other spouse's economic as well as mental health outcomes when they have access to paid leave. And then finally, this is in very early stages, but I'm pretty excited about it because I think it's so topical right now in the U.S. landscape. I'm looking at the impacts of access to reproductive health care in sort of the decade leading up to the Dobbs decision that took place last year. And we're trying to understand how access to facilities that can provide abortion care affect low-income young women's both mental and physical health. And so, while we can't predict exactly what's going to happen in the future, as access becomes lower as well as more inequitable in the United States. In the aftermath of the Dobbs decision, we can at least learn from the recent past in terms of understanding, what we can do, whom we might need to help more as access becomes lower.
Yeah, that's critical. Will you be doing more research around paid leave?
Yeah, I mean, I always have a affinity for paid leave. I think, as you suggested, as more and more states are passing policies, I think it's important to sort of keep working on them, keep researching them. So I'm looking forward to kind of updating some of the early work that we've done, looking at California's original implementation in 2004 and trying to understand the impacts of the more recent policies, including Connecticut, on families as well as employers. And like I said, I think expanding our understanding of these policies to folks that need leave for reasons other than having a new child is also really critical, and really where the policy debate is currently centered.
Yeah, very interesting about caregiver leave. And also, just to remind you, we put up our paid leave program on time and under budget, just so you know. It can be done.
That is awesome. Connecticut's leading the way.
Thank you so much for joining me on the Paid Leave podcast. It was such a pleasure to have you on, and keep doing that research, and let's hope for a national program soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You are awesome. Thank you so much, Maya Rossin-Slater. To apply for benefits, you can go to ctpaidleave.org. This has been another edition of the Paid Leave podcast. Please like and subscribe so you'll be notified about new podcasts that become available. Connecticut Paid Leave is a public act with a personal purpose. I'm Nancy Barrow, and thanks for listening.